And we're live.
Hello everyone, I'm Alison Board and I'm coming to you live today from SAA HQ. I'm going to be showing you how to paint a teasel in watercolour and Brusho, but it's going to be with a little bit of a difference because I'm going to be painting on wood. So let's get started. I've got a piece of wood here which I've actually recycled, found it on a local tip, and it's a piece of shiplap board. So it's got a very rough texture, which is the first thing that I need to address. So to do that, I've made a little sanding block. Now actually this is out of two pieces of the game Jenga, which I've glued together. And I've got a piece of fine grade sandpaper here. So I'm going to wrap the sandpaper around my sanding block. It just makes it a little bit easier to hold. And I'm just going to very quickly take the excess of the texture off of this piece of shiplap. So moving backwards and forwards and going with the grain, just to make sure that I take all of the rough quality out of this piece of wood. So as you can see already, I'm working over the top of this piece. This one's got a rather fabulous knot in it, and I would recommend that even if you've got a piece of wood with a bit of interest in it, that you just keep it. Don't pick anything that's too bland. Now, because we're live today, I'm actually going to move on to a piece that I've done earlier. So here I have got a piece of the same shiplap, but it's nice and smooth now. My sanding block has taken all of the excess off of this, and you don't have to listen to my noisy sanding. So what I'm going to do to prepare this ready to paint on watercolour, with watercolour, you could paint straight onto it, but you'd find that the wood either might be treated in some way, so it might repel the watercolour, or you might find that it's just far too absorbent and that the paint gets sucked into it. So I'm going to use a product designed especially for this kind of project, and that is the Daniel Smith Watercolor Ground. Now, watercolor ground comes in a variety of colours. You can get it in white and you can get it in black, but this time I'm going to use the transparent because I want to keep showing the nature of the wood. So take the lid off of this. And I'm going to use just an old brush. This is a brush that I would normally use for acrylic painting. And the idea of it is that you are going to damage it when you work it into the surface of the wood. So you don't want anything too special. You could use a bristle brush if that was easier. I just like a nylon because I think it gives a nicer finish. So I'm going to dip it in to the watercolor ground. Now the transparent watercolor ground is white when it goes on, but you will find that as it dries, it goes clear. And that's how you tell whether it's dry or not. Now you can accelerate the drying time with a hairdryer, but it's not ideal because what tends to happen is that it dries the surface and not the core. So if you can be patient, then it's a good idea to let it dry as naturally as possible. Now you might notice, particularly on this piece of wood or any piece of wood that you might have recycled from home, that it does take a little bit of effort to work the watercolour ground into the surface. But it's worth taking just a little bit of time to make sure that you scrub away with your watercolour ground right into that grain to make sure that everything is coated. And then when you come to paint with watercolour, you will find that it accepts the watercolour very easily. Now, the easiest way to do this is to actually create two coats. So this is the first coat going down, and you will notice that for the most part, I'm going with the grain of the wood. If you were using something as an alternative surface, so for example, you might want to paint on a piece of slate, or you might want to paint on a piece of metal, then you could afford to do it in whatever direction you like, or you could even use a soft roller, like a sponge roller, to get your watercolour ground on if that was easier. But because I'm working on a piece of wood today, I'm making sure that I'm pushing all of the ground right into the texture of this wood, working backwards and forwards. And as you can see, I don't need a thick coat of it at all. Just a thin coat will be absolutely enough to get it over the surface and get the first coat all sealed in nicely. So there we go. Not too worried about my brush strokes, but I am just making sure that that's a nice thin coat, and I'm working my way around the edges to make sure that I haven't got any excess that's going to dry at a different rate to the others. So there's my first coat on. As you can see, it's very easy to do, doesn't require a huge amount of skills. Now, again, because we're live, we can't stand around waiting for this to dry, so I have one with already one coat on it, which I'm just going to switch to now. So here is my piece of wood, and as you can see, the transparent ground has completely disappeared. You would never know. And I've put one coat of it on already. Now I'm going to put the second coat on. Now you could, if you wanted to, you could sand the first coat down exactly in the same way that you sanded off the excess texture, and then put a second and a third. How smooth it is entirely up to you. I quite like the rough grain of this piece of wood, so I've chosen to not sand my first coat down, and the second coat that I'm going to put on is just going to be enough to seal it, but I am going to go in the opposite direction. So as you saw in the previous step, I put my watercolour ground down on with the grain. Now I'm going to go against the grain, and there's a very good reason for that, which you will see. For the most part, with a fairly smooth piece of wood, you will find that this going with the second coat in the opposite direction, it goes on fairly smoothly, you don't need to worry about it. But if you have got some rough patches on yours, and as you can see here working over this knot, I'm having to really push that watercolour ground into the surface. Now, if I wasn't so careful with it, I might discover that when I actually come to paint with the watercolour on the top, that area might not be sealed as well. So it's worth just taking a little bit of time to really push that watercolour ground right into the texture. So I'm working across, working backwards and forwards, and really pushing this ground in. So we're going right over the top, and there you go, you can see I've got a little knot there. So I will actually deposit a little bit of the ground over the top, push it in with that brush, and that's what the nylon brush is really good at doing actually, is working into all the cracks and crevices. If it's easier and it's not getting pushed into the surface, what you can do is apply it with the grain and then go back over, putting it in the opposite direction. However you find it easiest. And to be honest, this is such an experimental technique that it's just worth having a play and seeing what you can achieve. So I'm going to make my way down this piece of wood so you can see very clearly how much ground you need to apply. And as I said, this ground is incredibly versatile stuff. So you can paint onto plastic or metal or glass even, and then be able to paint with watercolours over the top. So just coming to the bottom now, and I'm coming to a really textured part of the wood. So I'm just going to very quickly work it in with the grain and then go across the grain just to make sure I get a nice smooth finish to it. Just got a little lump in there which I'm going to chip off. Move on to my kitchen roll. So working my way right down to the bottom, and there where you can see I've got a really rough edge, my brush is working to get the watercolour ground into it. And this is another really good reason for not using anything special. If you've got any brushes that you think need retiring or have seen better days and have lost their point, then save them for this kind of work, because it is really useful to have things for varnishing or preparing ground. Just very quickly working my way back up to the top, and there you can see I've got the second coat of my watercolour ground on the surface, and then I would let that dry before I carried on doing any painting on top of it. Now, watercolour ground is water-based, so it's very, very simple to just wash your brush out in water, and you do need to give it a really, really good wash. So I'm going to really stab it on the bottom of my pot of water to make sure I get all of that out. Otherwise it'll sit deep in the hairs, and then my brush really won't be any use for anything else. Dry that off on the kitchen roll, and we can move on. So here is a piece that I'm actually going to do my painting on. As you can see, I've got some really good points of interest. I've got a couple of knots, and it's got a rather lovely grain, and you can almost see the watercolour ground. It gives it a sort of soft sheen, and you can feel it under your fingers, and anything that you prepare in this way you'll be able to see quite clearly. If your piece of wood has been treated or tannalised, you may just want to check that anything that it's been treated with isn't going to leach back through the surface, but you tend to find that sanding it down will usually take care of most of those things. But as I say, experiment, see what you come up with. So let's get painting. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to draw out my teasel. Now teasels are all over the place at the moment. They're all green and purple. So I'm going to use some of those colours to interpret it. I've got lots of teasels around my studio and I paint them all the time. So a real favourite for me. And I'm going to try and help you with how to draw them from scratch rather than tracing them with various ways that you can get them down onto the surface whilst painting onto my piece of wood. So I've got a pencil and I'm going to think about the shape of my teasel. So I'm going to start it in the top third and I'm going to use my pencil just to very lightly draw onto the surface a rough egg shape and an egg that's got a flat base to it. So just using some sketchy marks. There's something rather lovely about drawing onto a piece of wood. And then I'm going to think about how those spines occur on a teasel. So I'm going to start at the top with some of the longest spines, but rather than just draw around the edge so that there are just spines as a halo, I'm also going to try and think about the way those spines look in the centre of a teasel. And if you've ever looked at the centre of the teasel, you'll see that it's got a sort of honeycomb texture to it. So I'm also going to do a crisscross with my pencil so that around the edge I get these fabulous spikes. The first shape that I drew in gives it its overall look, but the scribble that I put in the middle is the bit that makes it look like it's got honeycomb. So I'm making my way down to the bottom, and this scribble that you develop through sketching and drawing, which is part of mark making, is really useful. It describes all sorts of shapes and texture in nature. So any of those sort of teasels or dandelion heads or any of those types of natural forms that you like to draw. And there's something very liberating about drawing in this way. So there's the main part of my teasel head. Now I'm going to think about the base of my teasel. And teasels tend to be enclosed in a type of cage of spines. So I'm going to start with some small ones coming up and around, and then I'm going to really go for it and put some nice large ones up and crossing over so that you get that nice cage look. You also tend to find that you've got some of them coming down around the base of the teasel too. Now I'm going to put the stem in. So I'm going to draw in my stem with a bit of a curve in it to give it some interest. And I'm going to use a broken line so that if my watercolour then goes past that line, it won't matter because I've got breaks in it so that the colour can go beyond it. And one final finish to the drawing of my teasel where I'm just going to put some little spikes coming out, because teasels are incredibly spiny and spiky. If you've ever tried to collect them, they can really hurt your hands. So I'm just going to describe those little spikes and spines all the way down the stem. And there it is. There's my teasel drawn out onto the wood, ready to go. Now it might seem odd painting onto a piece of wood, but honestly you can treat it exactly like you would do a piece of watercolour paper, and you're going to see me do the very same thing. So I'm going to take my tubes of watercolour and I'm going to start with Cerulean today. So I'm going to squeeze out a nice generous amount of Cerulean into my palette, and I'm going to start with a large brush. So a bit of water into that Cerulean to make a nice puddle of colour and make it nice and wishy-washy. Now when you're painting on wood, because of the colour of the wood, normally if you think about a sheet of watercolour paper, you would think about it being white and how the colour is normally going to sing on the surface. But because I've got a yellowy green piece of wood here, I'm going to have to think about that in my colours. So I'm going to mix my colours up stronger than I would do normally. And this is also a good experiment if you paint a little bit weak, or you find that you don't make your colours strong enough when you paint anyway, because you're going to have to make them stronger in order for them to show up. And then I'm going to do exactly as I would normally do for a watercolour painting. So I'm going to take my Cerulean blue, I'm going to put some of it down onto the surface, and then I'm going to use some water to blend it out. And as you can see, it works exactly the same as a normal watercolour painting. It's quite incredible. Because we have sized the wood to be able to accept watercolour, you can use all the blending out techniques that you would do if you were painting on a traditional surface. Whereas if we hadn't primed the wood, you would probably find that it acted a bit like blotting paper and sucked up too much of the colour. But I'm going to put plenty of this down because, as you will see, as it starts to dry, the colour dulls down quite a lot. So continuing on with my blue, working my way down around my teasel, adding a bit more colour for interest. You will also find that the colour tends to puddle and pool more than it would do on a sheet of watercolour paper, particularly if you're using a practice paper or a piece of student quality paper. And it's actually a little bit more forgiving, where that normally if you were working on a piece of student quality paper, you wouldn't be able to blend out the edges as I'm doing, it would have sunk in. But here you've got much more time. And I'm going to use my piece of kitchen roll, scrunched up like a rag roll, to drag over the surface just to lighten some of those areas. I can even pick that out so that I can see my teasel if I want to. So just adding a little bit of interest around, and you can see already how that colour is dulling into the watercolour ground, so you can see how much stronger you need to be able to paint. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use a wax resist stick, so that, a little bit like masking fluid, I can reserve some highlights. Now this can be done onto wet surface or dry surface. That is the major advantage of using wax, and it's going to repel the colour whilst providing some really interesting texture. So I'm looking for where my highlights are. Now again, because I'm working on a rough surface, you do tend to get a little bit of sediment building up there, but I'm just going to tap that off with a bit of kitchen roll, and I'm going to pull some of it down into my stem too. The wood is eating away at my wax stick, but at least I can see where I've been. Just tap that off ever so slightly, and there hopefully I've got some nice highlights reserved. So there's my background almost done, but because it's me, I am going to add a little bit of mixed media into it. So I have some Brusho. Here I have got a Gamboge Brusho, which is a lovely warm yellow colour, which I'm going to add into the background to give my teasel a little bit of personality and hopefully a little bit of movement. So the way that I like to apply Brusho is with just an old brush. Here I've got a little flat nylon brush, and I'm going to dip the brush into the powdered Brusho, just putting a little bit on the end, and I'm just going to very lightly tap off the excess and then transfer it over, and from on high just very lightly tap away some Brusho. Now if I find that, or if I think I've got too much down on the surface, I've got time with this technique to go back in with my nylon brush and just pick up some of the excess. Now because my background is still a little bit damp, you can probably see that it's starting to merge already, but I'm going to accelerate that with a spray bottle sprayed over onto the surface, and there you can see the Brusho start to do its magic. Now again, because we're working on wood, and that's a little bit different, and you can float your colour for longer on top of the watercolour ground, I'm going to twist my kitchen roll into a point, and any bits of it that I think are a little bit too strong, I'm going to tap out. Now you wouldn't be able to do this on watercolour paper. You would find that the Brusho stains it very quickly. But here you've got a little bit more working time. So if you are a slightly slower painter and you're thinking, well, I still like working in watercolour, then perhaps this is the answer for you. Try some alternative surfaces and you may find that your watercolour skills improve because you've been given a bit more time. So there I've got my texture on my background. I'm just going to put this Brusho away so that I don't spill it. And now I'm going to move on to painting the teasel in. So for that, I'm going to switch to some of my favourite colours. So I have a Cobalt Violet here. Put some of that out. And I have a Green Earth, which is a lovely mushy green. Love that colour. And I'm also going to have some Carbon Black, which is going to provide me with all my darks. So putting that on and switching to a medium-sized brush. And again, because we're working on wood and because it is a coloured background, you can afford to use your colours far stronger than you would do normally. Now these are the Maimeriblu watercolours, and these I like because they're, for me, the way that I paint, they're a little bit in between watercolour and gouache. So it means that I can use them a little bit thicker and they're still going to show up on my surface. So there's my size 8 brush loaded up with the colour ready to go, and I'm going to use that around the edges, and you can see straight away how the wax is starting to repel some of that colour. So I've already got a point of interest in there. So using a nice light touch, making sure my brush is fully loaded with colour. And do you remember we were talking about that lovely scribbly mark making texture? Well, that's exactly what I'm doing, but with a brush in my hand. So I'm crisscrossing just the tip of the brush, and then when I get out to the edges, I can be creating those lovely spines that you see on a teasel. So making my way down, there's the wax resist doing the thing that it does beautifully, so that it's just repelling the colour and I'm creating more texture. You can still see the wood through. Working my way down to the bottom, putting in as much or as little detail as I like. I just need a little bit more for that bit at the bottom to make sure that it's weighted. And then I'm also going to use this green just to start describing those little spiny areas at the bottom, which is what attaches the teasel to the stem. And then I mustn't neglect the stem, so a little bit more colour onto my brush, making sure that the tip is loaded and pulling that colour down the stem. You can see the wax is repelling it, and then actually going to wash out my brush, tap off the excess onto the kitchen roll and pull some of that colour down. It's merging in with the Brusho, which is a lovely happy accident, just to start putting some colour into that stem, and then it will just blend out into nothing at the bottom. Now another little trick I thought I would share with you whilst we've got a piece of wood here is a way of making your wood look a little bit more aged, but with watercolour in your hand. So I'm switching to my size 10 brush and I'm sticking with the green and mixing up a wash. So a little bit more water in with it this time, making sure I've got my kitchen roll in my other hand and loading up the brush. And instead of holding the brush this way as we would do when I'm painting, I'm switching my hand so that it's over the top of it so that I can use the flatter part of the brush. And then around the edges of my piece of wood, I'm dragging that colour in to create that kind of soft, focused, slightly vintage type of look. You can use some water and it creates a link up between the Cerulean and the Gamboge Brusho that we put on before. So I'm just going to do it at the top and the bottom, and then hopefully the bottom will make it look like it's sort of standing more in a field of lots of teasels or amongst grass than just floating on the surface. So a bit of water back into that, and there you can see that's all of my bright pale colours already on there. So let's get to work on this teasel and get it to start to come to life. Going back to my size 8 brush, and this time I'm going to go into the violet. And those that know me or know my work know that it's a colour I cannot resist. It goes into every painting I do if I can possibly help it. And this is a beautiful strong violet. So I'm making up a nice creamy consistency, and these brushes have got such a fabulous point on them that you can do lots of detail. Now that scribbly mark that we were doing earlier is going to be repeated, but I'm not going to put as much pressure on the brush this time. I'm literally just going to use the tip of it. Now I'm very lucky that the green hasn't quite dried yet, because of course that colour floats on the surface. So I can take advantage of that and start to get some real wet into wet look going on. So I'm crisscrossing. I'm being very careful not to completely obliterate the green that's on there. If you preferred your teasel to look a bit sharper, you could of course wait for the previous layer to dry, or you could dry it with a hairdryer. A hairdryer is not going to affect anything that you've put on apart from the wax. You might not want to hold the hairdryer too close to the wax that you've put on, or of course it might just make it disappear altogether. And I'm going to use that nice flicked out motion to describe the edges of the teasel. So coming backwards and forwards to create that honeycomb. Do you remember that we talked about at the top of the broadcast? It's got a little bit too much colour on my brush, so I'm taking the excess off. And the Wax Resist is working at its absolute best and providing me with lots of texture. Just going to mix up a slightly deeper colour for that, flick out those spines over the top of my Brusho. Now it's gone a little bit fuzzy on this side, but of course because we're broadcasting live, I'm just going to go with it and I'll have a slightly fuzzy teasel. So going to work our way down here, continuing that crisscross, very light touch, a bit more colour, coming all the way down the bottom. This is part of the process that you could really spend much more time on it than I have to describe things. Coming down to the bottom, just getting a bit of weight into it now. And you can see that here, where it's dried a bit more, I'm getting a bit more description out of it. And then again, into those spines and pulling some colour down to the bottom. There we go. Washing out my brush, pulling some of that colour over the top of the wax, which is repelling it beautifully. I couldn't ask it to do a better job. So I've got a few of those spiny entities there. Pulling that down to the bottom, and then hopefully you can see that that spine is really the stem is really starting to stand out now. A little bit more colour to go in, and making my way down to the bottom. There we go. Just going to mop that up very slightly. There we go. That's how much time you have to work with. In fact, I could tear a little bit of kitchen roll to make to a point, and then feed it back in to take off some of the colour to describe those spines. Another happy accident to make it look just spiky. So we need a couple of final flourishes for this painting, and for those I'm going to switch to a rigger brush, so the long fine hairs, which are great for doing long grass type shapes. And this time I'm going to switch to the black. Now you don't need the black to be quite a stronger colour, obviously, because it's strong enough as it is. I'll just test it on a piece of kitchen roll to see whether it's as strong as I want it to be. And I'm going to use the tip of the rigger just to provide a little bit of shading on my teasel at the bottom. So again, using that lovely scribbly texture with my brush, pulling it, building up the colour in layers. And then I'm going to use the rigger, and rather than choke the brush down here, I'm going to move my hand back along the rigger so I have slightly less control over it. And then I'm going to use it to create this lovely cage that we talked about. In fact, I'm just going to dip my brush into the violet as well as the black, so I get a nice variation. Now you can see you get a nice soft edge on it, because it's still moving. You wouldn't believe, would you? It's still creeping and moving around on my surface. And there's another one to go in there. You can finish it off with as many spikes and spines as you would like. And then, because it's one of my paintings and because I always tend to do this at the end of a picture, I'm going to do a little bit of spattering. So I'm going to load up my brush with, you can choose whatever colour you like, whether you want it to be very strong or very subtle. I'm going to start with the Cerulean, and I'm going to just flick a bit of colour over the top, which will add to that Brusho. Pick up a little bit of the black as well. And there you go. Just a little final flourish on the teasel head. And you can play about with it and finish it to your heart's content. You can do whatever you like with it. I hope that's given you a few ideas for some alternative surfaces that you can work on. Thanks very much for joining us here at SAA HQ, and hope to see you again soon.